Welcome back to the channel. A few years ago, I did a video where I showed how to make quilt-as-you-go pot holders in the log cabin design. The good thing about those is that I also like to use them for coasters in my family room. And I've been wanting to make some for a while now with Halloween colors and autumn or fall colors for Thanksgiving. At the end of this video, I also have some other ideas for coasters or pot holders. And I'll put the link to the video I did a few years ago in the description box. So on with the fall and the Halloween coasters. I start by laying out all the fabrics that I think would look good. I have a mix of black and Halloween prints and orange fabrics. I have enough of these two fabrics to use for the back and the binding. I'm trying to figure out if I have enough of this fabric for the backing for the fall or Thanksgiving coasters. I need an 8-inch square for the backing, and I plan on making 4 of them, so I need 4 8-inch squares. These are the fabrics that I have laid out for the Thanksgiving coasters. I have enough of these two fabrics for the binding. Before I cut the fabric, I like to lay it out kind of in the pattern that I'm going to be doing to get a sense for whether I like it. I start by making a 1.5-inch square out of the gold fabric with my rotary cutter and ruler. I'm making 4 coaster pot holders in this pattern. So I'm going to cut out 4 1.5-inch squares. Next, I'm stacking burgundy fabric together, and I'm comfortable stacking as many as 4 pieces and cutting those. And I'm making another set of 1.5-inch squares in the burgundy fabric. Different fabric, but same color, and I'm making 1.5-inch by 2.5-inch pieces. Next, I'm cutting 1.5 by 2.5-inch pieces in the brown fabric. Then also a 3.5-inch length in the brown fabric. You can see how in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, I am making up a design as I go so that I have a better chance of getting it right. It sometimes is confusing to me. For the other pieces, I am laying them in the strips in piles in the order that I will be using them. For the rust-colored fabric, I will be cutting 1.5-inch widths and then cutting 3.5-inch and 4.5-inch lengths for those. Next, I'm cutting 1.5-inch strips out of this gold-colored fabric and cutting them into 4.5-inch and 5.5-inch lengths. I'm cutting this burgundy fabric into 5.5-inch and 6.5-inch lengths, and it will go next to the rust-colored fabric. On the last set of these, I will need to sew 2 pieces of the burgundy fabric together. I didn't have quite enough to make one last 6.5-inch strip. The last strip set will be in this brown fabric. And I cut 6.5 inch and 7.5 inch long strips for that. I always like to stack these into the order in which I am going to sew them. And if I'm not able to get to it right away, I even like to store them in Ziploc sandwich bags. That way the pieces stay together and don't get lost. I didn't have enough of this fabric to use for the backing for all 4 8-inch squares, but I really love it and wanted to use it. So I figured out how I can piece the pieces together to get 4 8-inch squares. And I'll show you when I move to the sewing machine how I intend to do that. Since I'm keeping these coasters for myself and not using them as gifts, I really don't mind that there will be a seam on the back. And I don't think it will show that much anyway with the quilting. If I sew these 2 pieces together, I'll be able to get 2 8-inch pieces from this. And here's a third 8-inch square. So I'll just need to sew these 2 pieces together and I'll have enough for a backing. And yes, I do know that the turkeys on the bottom are going a different direction than the turkeys on the top piece. But I'm not all that worried about it. So with a little bit of stitching, I'll have the 4 8-inch squares that I need for the backing for the fall coasters. I'm hoping that I have enough of this fabric for binding. If not, I'll use that more gold fabric on 1 or 2 of them. But I haven't cut that out yet. I'm just going to wait and see if this will work and give me enough for 4. I'm cutting these pieces 3 inches wide. I'm just laying out the fabrics for the Halloween coasters here. And I went and cut them out the same measurements as the first group. I just wanted to show you this, that you need to be careful if you're cutting fabric that's folded. I thought that I had missed the selvage or gotten all of the selvage, but when I opened it up, I realized that there was a good part of it still left, so I was able to cut that off. I'm cutting the 3-inch binding for the Halloween coasters or pot holders now, and then I'm cutting the 8-inch squares for the back. I ironed the squares and the little pieces. At the sewing machine now to make the binding. I take the ends of 2 separate binding pieces, right sides facing, perpendicular to each other, and then stitch it on the sewing machine from corner to corner diagonally. If you need to use your ruler and draw a line from corner to corner as a stitching line to help you as you sew, go right ahead and do that. And voila. I always check it to make sure that it lines up, and then I cut the corners off, trimming it about 1/4 inch from the stitching. And now I'm going to go ahead and sew all of the binding together on the gold binding and the orange binding. And then I'll fold those in half vertically, give it a good steam press, and then roll it up so that it's ready to use when I'm ready for it. I like sewing the binding seam on the diagonal. That way you don't have two seams right on top of each other when you go to sew your binding on. But you could sew your seams straight if that's what you wanted to do. This is just my personal preference. I found some pieces of this burgundy in my sewing room, and so I'm taking a minute just to cut a 7.5 inch length so that I don't have to sew two pieces together to get that last piece on that fall coaster. So now I'm pulling out the Insul-bright that I purchased, and I am going to be cutting that into 8-inch squares. So if you've never worked with this before, this is a batting that has an insulated lining in it that looks like a piece of tin foil, really thin tin foil in the middle of it. I'm showing you here that it comes with the instructions to make an oven mitt, but you're going to have to enlarge the pattern because it's not quite to size. It says on the instructions not to use it in the microwave, so just be aware that if you happen to make a bowl cozy out of this, that you're not to put it in the microwave, as it will probably start a fire. So I've got 4 8-inch squares here, and I'm left with these ends that I will probably zigzag together so that I can use them as well. I wanted to get cotton batting so that if I use these for pot holders that they would be heat safe with no chance of melting. However, I forgot to read the fine print, the one that says 80% cotton and 20% polyester. So you do what you want, just be aware of that. I think that the pot holders I've made in the past have been made with polyester batting, or at least a blend of polyester and cotton. And I've never had any issues, but if you want to do pure cotton. Just be aware of that. You may also want to consider using pure cotton thread too. In the past, it was never an issue with me, and I never thought to look to see if I was using polyester thread or not, and I've never had any problems with it melting with the hot pads, but just be aware of that. So I have my 8-inch squares of Insul-bright and batting now. I was going to do 2 squares of batting and 1 square of Insul-bright because the batting is so thin, but I think I'm going to do 1 of each. At least for what I'm doing, it's not going to make that much of a difference. And I think that it would be fine for hot pads as well. But I'll let you know. Once I get them made, I'll try it out with something hot from the oven. You start out with the fabric square that you're going to use for the backing with the right side down. Then you put a square of the Insul-bright, and just think of it that you're making an Insul-bright sandwich. It doesn't matter which side is up or down. They're both the same on that. Then I put my batting on top. Then I put the 1.5-inch square that is going to be the middle square down, right side up, and the square that goes next, the burgundy square, right side down on top of that. And I'm going to make sure that these are completely centered by measuring 3¼ inches all the way around them with my little ruler. And I showed you with my finger there, I don't know if you caught that, where I was planning on stitching because I want the turkeys to be right side up in the back. And so I am going to stitch where it is the top now. And I place a pin in it so that I know which edge I need to stitch on. I'm measuring 1/4 inch from my needle to a certain place on my presser foot so I know where I need to be for the seam allowance as I'm stitching. My thread is a cream color so it will match the backing of this, and I start by making a 1/4 inch seam. I start a little bit from the top so that the stitches will match more evenly, and I make a seam and then cut the threads. You need to be sure to tack down as you start and as you finish so that your stitching doesn't come apart on this. I like to finger press it down really well as I open it so that the seam will stay open. The 2.5-inch burgundy piece will go on the right side of this. And again, I go down about 1/8 inch from the top, tack it down, and then stitch it 1/4 inch from the edge. And then tack it down about 1/8 inch from the bottom. The 2.5-inch brown piece goes next. Right sides facing, and then the same procedure as the other two. The 3.5-inch brown piece goes next. 2 years ago, I made a lap size quilt out of this method using teal and gray fabrics. So if you're interested in making a quilt as you go log cabin quilt, I will leave the link to that video in the description box. The 3.5-inch rust piece goes next, over where the 1.5-inch burgundy square was, or is. I'm motioning with my finger here how I like to line up the edge of the fabric against the seam that has already been made to try and keep things straight. Sometimes things will get a little off kilter. You just have to figure out how to align it best yourself. The 4.5-inch rust piece goes next against the 2.5-inch burgundy piece. I hit a problem here where the thread was actually wrapped around the presser foot and wouldn't move, and I didn't realize that at first, so cut the threads, but then just resumed with tacking it down and continuing the stitching. So not a big deal. Next goes the 4.5-inch gold piece on top of the 2.5-inch brown piece. The 5.5-inch gold piece goes on top the 3.5-inch brown piece. The 5.5-inch burgundy piece goes on top of the 3.5-inch rust piece. You can see here how my quilt sandwich is shifting a little bit, and I just hope that that's not going to be a problem when I go to straighten it up and square it up. This was the last strip on this side, so I'm just going to pin it down to keep it from flying over and having any mistakes. Here goes the 6.5-inch burgundy piece against the 4.5-inch rust piece. I have my sewing machine on a plastic folding table, and so that's why it shakes so bad. This is what the back is looking like, and I will go back and trim all of those threads off later. The 6.5 inch brown piece is going on top of the 4.5 inch gold piece. And finally, the 7.5 inch brown piece is going on top of the 5.5 inch gold piece. And voila! So I'm hoping I can trim these imperfections off and put the binding on without any gaps. Even with all of these squares that I've made, it seems like the first one after there's been a gap in me making them is always a learning process. This shifted really badly, and so I am just going to try and square it up the best that I can. So you can see that there are some spots on this that are as wide as the seam allowance is going to be. So I decided to go back with the rotary cutter and take a little bit more off of those sides. And it always helps if you pull the blade up on the rotary cutter before you go to cut. To safeguard against this happening to you, you may want to consider another 1/2 inch larger on your fabric, your backing, and your Insul-bright and your batting. But everything went a little better with the Halloween coaster as I was repositioning it, as I was sewing it, and it didn't seem to shift as badly. At the machine now to put the binding on, and I have it laying on the top, and I forgot that I usually like to do the first go around on the back side. And I've been asked before why I do it that way and don't have the pretty even looking part of the binding on the front. But I like to stitch it down on the back first and then pull the binding around to the front and do the stitching that way because I can never get it right so that it goes into the ditch, and I'd rather have the uneven stitching showing on the back than on the front. So you do it the other way if you'd prefer to. I need to go down a couple of inches from the binding, from the edge of the binding before I start stitching, so that I have enough room to fold that under when I come back around. And I'm stitching 1/4 inch from the edge, but I'm being careful as I get to those places where it was 1/4 inch of fabric or batting showing, so that I don't have that showing through. You probably noticed that I put my finger there so that I would know where the edge was on that. When I get about 1/4 inch from the edge or from the end, I am going to lift up the presser foot and pivot the fabric so that it's going towards the corner, and then run it off the edge of the corner, and then snip the threads. Now, I've had questions about this next step, and if you've never done binding like this before, watch very carefully. So I'm making a fold at the top edge, which is also making a fold, a diagonal fold, underneath. I will put the presser foot about 1/4 inch from the top edge, and then tack it down and continue sewing. And then I'll just continue the process until I go all the way around to where I started. This last corner is going to be a little different, as I'm also going to tie off or finish the binding here. So I folded the binding at the edge, and now I am going to trim about a 1/2 inch, trim the binding, cut the binding about a 1/2 inch larger than the ending, or maybe a little bit more. You'll see what I mean. And don't use these snippers to cut fabric. I was too lazy to go get my fabric scissors in the other room, and so that's what I did, but you'll do better than me. So I've cut the binding, and then I take the first edge, or the first end of binding, and go ahead and tuck it in so that I have a finished edge. And so I'm folding it over about 1/4 inch, and then I am going to tuck that end, the last part of the binding, into that, and then sew from the corner over those ends to secure it. And here we go. Tacking it down 1/4 inch from the top, and then sewing it to meet that beginning stitching. And then tacking it down again, or back stitching to secure the binding. I actually took the stitching a little bit further down, as I had some uneven stitching from the first go around. And now the moment of truth. So now I am just going to flip the binding around to the front, and then stitch it down with a top stitching. And then we'll be done with one coaster. What I like to do is start pretty close to where the fold over was to that binding. And so I go ahead and tack it down, and then stitch pretty close to the edge. And then when I get to the corner, I go ahead and I tack it down before I fold over the other edge, being careful not to snag the other edge's binding. So you can see here, I'm tacking it down, and then I'm cutting the threads, and then I will fold over the edge on the other side and repeat the process. This is the method that works best for me in this part of the project. You may want to do it differently, and if you do, that's great, but I have better luck doing it this way. You know, this is one of those aha moments, and I have a walking foot, and I don't know why. I didn't even think to use it for this, but that probably would have helped with all of that shifting. I probably wouldn't have gotten as much of that if I had used it. So if you have a walking foot, get that out now and use that. And if you don't, you can see that it's still possible to make these without one. I've gotten questions before about why don't I make the last row of strips, why don't I make them wider so that after I put the binding on that they are not as skinny, they're the same width as the other ones. And the short answer is that it doesn't really bother me all that much. But if it's something that you would like to have them be a little wider, then just cut them a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch wider, and make sure that your backing, Insul-bright, and batting will accommodate that. This is a little late to be bringing this up, and it's kind of an afterthought as well. But when you put the binding on, when you do the first go around, you're making sure that the raw edges are against your raw edges of the coaster, and so that you have a nice clean finish with the folded edge when you flip it around to the front. And I thought I'd just clarify that if you didn't notice, if you're new to quilting and didn't notice that that's what I did. When I was new, I didn't realize that that's how you put a binding on. So just a little clarification there. Jenny Doan has a really good tutorial on binding, on how to make binding and how to attach it to your quilt. And if you're interested in that, you can either go onto my playlists, and it's on the quilting playlist, or I can attach that link in the description box with the other links. Here I am just sewing those two pieces of fabric together so that I have more material for the backing for my fall coasters. And then sewing the other two pieces together for the single 8-inch square. Both of these pieces will need to be ironed flat and then cut to the right measurements before using. I have my pieces for my Halloween coaster all ready to go. And I'm doing it in a time lapse, so watch carefully or you'll miss it. And here it is. I am going to sew up the other 3 coasters to each set on another day. I wanted to show you a pot holder that my friend Marcia made for me a couple of years ago. It wasn't made as quilt as you go, but it could totally be done that way. You have your backing layer and your Insul-bright and batting sandwich, and then go ahead and cut your strips. The 3 rectangles on the top are approximately 3 inches by 5.5 inches, and I've added a few bits of length there to accommodate stitching. The bottom rectangle is approximately 3 inches by 7.5 inches. It must have been about 8 by 8.5 inches before sewing. She didn't do this as quilt as you go. She pieced her top together first, then made her sandwich, but put the top right side down and sewed it together, leaving a little gap or a little space so that she could put it right side out. And then she sewed around the edges, and then she quilted the top. And she also put like a ribbon loop in there, or I guess it's made out of the black fabric. It doesn't feel like she used any Insul-bright in here, so I think that there's either 1 layer or 2 layers of regular batting. Marcia is no longer with us, and so I am just so happy that I have something of hers that she made. Here are some Christmas ones that I made many years ago, and I like to pull these out during the holidays. I also showed these in a video that I did a couple of years ago, and I'll leave the link to that in the description box. As you can see, when I first started making these pot holders, I was putting a hanging loop on them. But I don't really like adding a loop, and I never use it. I use them more as coasters, or if I use them for pot holders, I put them in a drawer. I made the Heart Log Cabin coaster / hot pad a couple of years ago, and I made a video of that, and I'll leave the link to that in the description box as well. I wanted to show you how I use these. They're great for protecting your furniture. You can see that end table's a little rough, but if you have fine furniture, it's great. They're bigger, and so you could make them smaller if you prefer, but I like it a little bigger. If I wanted to put a plate or a bowl on it, it would be large enough for that. So thank you for joining me as I make the seasonal coasters and pot holders. Goodbye.